Sometimes we are blessed with the capacity and the choice to determine the arena, the manner, and the time of our revolution. But most often, we are left to do battle where we are standing. The real blessing is to be able to use who we are, where we are, in concert with as many others as possible, or alone if need be. This is a profound quote that has shaped my life and my practice, both as an activist and an advocate and a student affairs professional, from Audre Lorde, talking about the places and spaces in which she came to do her work as a scholar, an activist, and intellectual. If you would have asked me 20 years ago as a teenager what I was going to do with my life, I would have told you without a doubt that I was going to pastor churches. I knew that when I applied to college, and when I went to college, I studied and I got a religious studies degree, a certification in church careers, and went promptly on to seminary. So if you would have told that person 20 years ago that I would be standing here, I would have told you you had lost your mind. I had no interest in doing student affairs work until I literally fell into my job. And so what I am going to actually talk to you today about is this issue of situated knowledge and how we come to stand in certain places and the ways standing in those places transforms our sort of practice. I think I am a better student affairs professional because I am not trained in student affairs. So anyone out there who was not trained and does not have a traditional student affairs pedigree, shout out, come on. All right, you've got my love, okay? I've done a lot of things, incidentally, in my life. I've worked at a quilt store and a coffee shop. That's how I got health insurance for a while. I have my job now in student affairs. But I really want to talk to you about 3 of the things that I've done and the ways that those sort of situated knowledges, what we might also call like alternative epistemologies, have informed my practice. So I'm going to talk to you about being a pastor, an activist, and a scholar. Let's start with being a pastor. This is the first alb I ever bought. In order to purchase this alb, I literally went with some of my colleagues while I was at seminary to a Catholic supply store called Gherkins and went and looked at all of their albs. And I was like, I need the ones for someone who's short. And they're like, all of these albs are made for men. I was like, I don't care, I need one. So like, where are the short albs? Because I am not tall for a man. I'm relatively normal for a woman in terms of my height. So I went there and I stood in this like Catholic supply store and I picked out this alb with some of my other friends and I purchased it from this little nun who looked at me like I was insane. And this has been the alb that I have literally worn for all of the most important sort of sermons and spaces that I've ever given as a pastor. One of the things that has been profoundly important to me as a pastor and in my theological education, it was really queer theology that got me to a place where I could come to terms with my sexual orientation. I am a queer woman, and I realized that at 15, so about the same time that I was realizing a call to ministry, I realized that I was a queer person and struggled with that a lot in a way. And so in the midst of that struggle, I started to read queer theology. And queer theologians like MoSAIC Reed was writing at that time about things called indecent theology. The idea that our theologies are deeply embodied and that our bodies really matter. And so queer theologians like MoSAIC Reed and Chris Glazier were saying things at a time that were saying that queerness was not something we had to be apologizing about, but these were profoundly important parts of our bodies and our communities as a body, and that we shouldn't have to we shouldn't have to apologize for those things, but we should embrace them as part of our fundamental practice, that these are important things. And so as a young scholar and theologian, I started to understand that the things that make us different are not things that we should apologize for, but they are profoundly things that we should celebrate, and that those distinctions are what matters, not that we are the same, but that we are different. And so queer theory and queer theologians did that for me. And being in communities and in contexts of communities, my theological education and being a pastor made me take seriously difference as a part of my practice. So, as I said, I was queer, and I am a United Methodist person that went to United Methodist Seminary, and queer folks cannot be ordained in the Methodist Church. So after I was at seminary, I finally decided that I needed to sort of leave the pastorate, and because I was not going to be able to sustain myself as a whole person in those spaces. And so I actually left pastoring and started becoming a community organizer, because those were already things that I was doing in churches. And so then I spent some time as an activist. And one of the things that I think I have really appreciated as being an activist, I was once in a supervision meeting with my supervisor, and he said, as student affairs professionals, we really love the gray. And I was like, I don't love the gray. He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, no, I don't really love the gray at all. I was like, the part of me that's used to doing justice work really likes the justice, right? It's not about the gray. It's really about justice. Activists have a certain kind of capacity to see in a very narrow way, what is right and what needs to happen to get there, right? And so it makes most activists profoundly capable of attacking a problem and solving a problem in a really direct sort of way. That does not mean that we cannot see, and that many activists cannot see gray, or that we don't understand or appreciate sort of complexity, because the world is a complex world, but strategic thinking as an activist and a grassroots organizer is about sort of narrowly looking at a problem, determining what action that needs to occur to address that problem, and who you need to leverage, who or what you need to leverage in order to get at that problem. And then that's how you decide on tactics. And so my strategic mind, the part of me that is strategically minded, was the part that was grown and cultivated in the streets, in protests, in trainings. So I did this for a while, and then I met my wife while working 2 jobs, and my wife encouraged me that maybe I wanted to do things other than be broke all the time and work 2 jobs just to have health insurance. And so she's like, look, you were a brilliant activist, why don't you go back to school and study social movements? And so that's how I ended up at Georgia State University in a comm department. So I went ahead and I joined a communication department at Georgia State University that was actually very interested in questions of power and the ways in which issues and questions of power sort of inform the way that we communicate. So my graduate degree in that communication department is on human communication and social influence, and I'm a social movement scholar. And so books and ideas became such an important part of how I think about and how I did the work that I was about. Because so when you're in the streets doing the work of activism, right, what really matters here is ideas in practice, but the ideas matter, right? Rich ideas, having diversity of thinking, having the capacity to think richly and deeply about a problem are all things that hopefully our best graduate programs encourage and inspire. And so I went back to school to study to study social movements. And while I was doing that, I ran out of funding in my department because of some cuts in the department, and I needed a graduate assistantship to finish my program. And lo and behold, an email comes from the Multicultural Center at Georgia State University, and they needed to hire someone. And I was like, oh, look, it's for a multicultural competence and education position. I was like, oh, I do all these things as an organizer, so I'm just gonna do that so I can finish this degree. And so I started working at this moment completely by chance as a student affairs professional. Now, what happened because of that, I think, is actually extraordinary. I ended up in the job, and I was good at it, and everyone was like, you need to apply for the full-time position of your job when it becomes available, and so I did. And so when I started as a full-time professional at Georgia State University, I was hired at the exact same time as Christina Wan. Many of you know Christina Wan. Where is Christina? Is she in the room? Shout out to Christina Wan. Hey. I love Christina very much. She started at the same time as me. And I actually think that our practice as student affairs professionals was stronger because we were hired together and because we are so different. Christina has a traditional student affairs pedigree. She comes out of housing. She sort of understands student affairs as a sort of profession, and I do not. And so we were made better by each other, and she's politically deeply savvy in terms of that, and I am not. But our functional area was made stronger by the fact that the way I looked at the world had not been made and cultivated in student affairs. The way I thought and looked at the world had been created by the streets and the pulpit and the academy, and that those were the things that I brought to my work in our center. When I originally made this speech, I was not really going to talk a lot about our contemporary political situation. And the more I thought about situated knowledge, the less I felt I could talk about how we come to create knowledge in the context and in our social location without talking about our current political climate. So one of the things I want to say is, here's the ask, right? For those of you who are out there, what do we do about this, right? Many of us already have a traditional student affairs pedigree, so like, who cares that like I came to this job in a sort of unique way? What does that matter for you? For those of you who are in charge of hiring, I would encourage you to be bold in your hiring. Be willing to hire folks who don't look like you. Be willing to folks to... When we attach that line or other experience as appropriate, take that seriously, because other folks who come from other spaces who are trained in different fields, they can bring something very rich to our practice as student affairs professionals. And then when you do that, you have to make space for them to be the people that they are. And so I have been really blessed. When I first started working at the Multicultural Center, Dr. Daryl Holloman, who is the Dean of Students there, came in and was like, we are so happy to have Laci here. She will do the scary programs. And I was like, oh God, that's scary. But I practiced in an environment in which people were willing to make space for me to do things differently because I was different. To address our current political climate, part of that too is we have to find ways as student affairs professionals to sort of get in the game. It matters to our students, right? Our political climate fundamentally changes the way they experience the world. So the extent to which we are willing to sort of get in on the political game, it matters. So I have made the commitment, so I will encourage you to do something similarly. Right now, I am writing a letter every day to President Trump that says something about the world in which we live. These are examples of cards I buy. I go around and I buy cards that I say, do you sell any cards that look queer or leftist or socialist in nature? And they're like, what? So I've had some luck. And every day I sit down and I write a letter, Dear Donald Trump, and I say something to the president about our political climate. So I encourage you, be bold in being different and help one another to do that as well. And do that not only in your professional work, but also in the world, because our students live in the world. And so we need to be practicing there as well for them. Thank you.